Hello and welcome to the first installment of Amplify This, the Autism Acceptance Video Blog Challenge. You'll have to forgive me, this is my first video blog post and I am a touch nervous, so I will probably do more reading than I should. My goal during this series is to highlight important and notable writings of autistic people and to use my voice as a supporter and activist for human rights to amplify their messages and their movement towards acceptance. The first post we'll be looking at tonight is laying the fundamental groundwork for the Autism Acceptance Campaign. We are going to look at the very basic question of what is autism, which, as anyone in the autism community can tell you, is a little bit less than basic. Clearly, there are no shortages of articles on autism written from the medical and parent perspectives, but very few focus on the interpretations from the autistic community themselves, including their own first-hand experience. Nick Walker answered this call with the following post, synthesizing cohesively and coherently what so many had struggled to put into words. A few quick biographical notes. Nick is an autistic educator, author, speaker, transdisciplinary scholar, and martial artist. He holds a 6th-degree black belt in Aikido and is founder and senior instructor of the Aikido Shusakai Dojo in Berkeley, California. Nick is also a faculty member in the Interdisciplinary Studies program at the California Institute of Integral Studies and the undergraduate psychology program at Sophia University. He is also a longtime member of the experimental physical theater group Paratheatrical Research. Nick is a leading thinker in the emergent field of neurodiversity and has been deeply involved in autistic community and culture since 2003. Because of the importance of the message of this particular post, I will be reading it in its entirety with permission from the author. So, without further ado, Nick Walker's What is Autism? Autism is a genetically based human neurological variant. The complex set of interrelated characteristics that distinguish autistic neurology from non-autistic neurology is not yet fully understood, but current evidence indicates that the central distinction is that autistic brains are characterized by particularly high levels of synaptic connectivity and responsiveness. This tends to make the autistic individual's subjective experience more intense and chaotic than that of non-autistic individuals. On both sensory motor and cognitive levels, the autistic mind tends to register more information, and the impact of each bit of information tends to be both stronger and less predictable. Autism is a developmental phenomenon, meaning that it begins in utero and has a pervasive influence on development on multiple levels throughout the lifespan. Autism produces distinctive, atypical ways of thinking, moving, interaction, and sensory and cognitive processing. One analogy that has often been made is that autistic individuals have a different neurological operating system than non-autistic individuals. According to the current estimates, somewhere between 1% and 2% of the world's population is autistic. While the number of individuals diagnosed as autistic has increased continually over the past few decades, evidence suggests that this increase in diagnosis is the result of increased public and professional awareness rather than an actual increase in the prevalence of autism. Despite underlying neurological commonalities, autistic individuals are vastly different from one another. Some autistic individuals exhibit exceptional cognitive talents. However, in the context of a society designed around the sensory, cognitive, developmental, and social needs of non-autistic individuals, autistic individuals are almost always disabled to some degree, sometimes quite obviously, and sometimes more subtly. The realm of social interaction is one context in which autistic individuals tend to consistently be disabled. An autistic child's sensory experience of the world is more intense and chaotic than that of a non-autistic child, and the ongoing task of navigating and integrating that experience thus occupies more of the autistic child's attention and energy. This means the autistic child has less attention and less energy available to focus on the subtleties of social interaction. Difficulty meeting the social expectation of non-autistics often results in social rejection, which further compounds social difficulties and impedes social development. For this reason, autism has frequently been misconstrued as being essentially a set of social and communication deficits by those who are unaware that the social challenges faced by autistic individuals are just byproducts of the intense and chaotic nature of autistic sensory and cognitive experience. Autism is still widely regarded as a disorder, but this view has been challenged in recent years by proponents of neurodiversity model, which holds that autism and other neurocognitive variants are simply part of the natural spectrum of human biodiversity, like the variations in ethnicity or sexual orientation, which have also been pathologized in the past. Ultimately, to describe autism as a disorder represents a value judgment rather than a scientific fact. There are a few things in this post that I would like to highlight, particularly bringing us back to that topic of autism acceptance and this overarching theme of what we're trying to do over the course of the month of April. As Nick tells us, autism is a naturally occurring phenomenon, a human variant functionally no different from the extensive gamut of variants that characterize each of us. I know that he made allusion to the conversation around orientation and sexuality, which many people don't know was actually ranked as a disorder. So people who were homosexual were considered disordered up until 1974. The LGBTQ movement, of course, made great strides in that, and now most people acknowledge and understand that gender and sexual orientation are spectrums, and that the variances in this spectrum are all naturally occurring and acceptable and need to be embraced and accepted as well as celebrated. Another post that Nick makes, or another point that Nick makes, pardon me, is that 1 to 2% of the world's population is currently estimated to be autistic. Now, we hear a lot in the autism community about the rise of autism and the epidemic and all of these concepts talking about how autism is a phenomenon that seems to be getting worse. The evidence simply isn't there to back up some of these allegations. What we do know is that we have both increased the knowledge base and the definition of how we look at autism. This has allowed the medical community to pinpoint and identify autistic people from a much younger age and in a much broader spectrum. So where an individual may not have been diagnosed as autistic when they were 2 or 3 or 4 in the 1970s, because they had the ability to speak, we now recognize that autism is a much larger set of characteristics, and that this individual very well may have been identified that way today. Another thing to consider as we talk about April and about this whole Light It Up Blue campaign is that once upon a time, women were considered to be anomalies in the autistic spectrum. So it was believed that autism affected boys at a much higher rate than girls, and that girls were often tossed aside in terms of that diagnostic criteria and given a gamut of other diagnoses, whether that be ADHD, OCD, language disorders, gross motor disorders, fine motor disorders, or just general social awkwardness, which I know many autistic women now look back and say, yeah, they probably could have seen this one coming. Certainly, what we do know is that autism is a condition and a variation that occurs in utero, and that is not only not helped by campaigns for curing and prevention and so on, but that these are very misguided in terms of the research that we have, indicating that, again, autism is a naturally occurring variant, and that what we need to look at is more how do we support, how do we accommodate, and how do we integrate into society, which means really breaking down some of those social barriers that we are so keenly accustomed to. The third point I wanted to look at is that the level of disability for each autistic person varies according to their social environment and their ability to navigate difficult environmental factors. However, as Nick pointed out, most autistic people experience some form of disability in a variety of contexts. A person's ability to navigate one area, for example, speech, is not indicative of whether or not they experience disabilities in other areas, such as motor planning or social communication. This is a widely misunderstood phenomenon in the autism community, where we'll often hear people dismissed because of their ability to engage in writing or in speech. One of the phrases that we hear a lot when parents are talking to autistic adults is that you are not like my child. My child is non-speaking, or my child has issues with toileting and self-care and will never live independently. And what's always baffling about these conversations is, first and foremost, the parent in question likely has very little information about the autistic person that they're speaking to. We certainly don't know whether or not they live independently, semi-independently, or if they do require everyday support in their living. Beyond that, we don't know how their skills have progressed through the years. Many children will begin as non-speaking and eventually grow into having functional use of speech, as the doctors would like to call it. But beyond that, even with the ability to speak and even with the ability to live in a semi-independent life, disabilities are a reality of social environment. And so depending on how that person experiences their autistic mind, they may feel different disabilities in different contexts. And it's very hard to get a full picture of how disabled a person can be without simply asking them their actual level of disability within a certain framework. It is extremely dangerous to make assumptions about another person's neurology and their way of taking in the world. Certainly, you would not want to do that against their own claims and their own experience and knowledge. So I think that that's definitely something that I was really grateful for Nick to bring to the forefront of this discussion, that disability is, well, there's certainly the medical model of whether or not the body is physically impaired from doing an action or completing a task, but there's also an entire social model to disability which talks about how we integrate into our environment. I often use the allegory of I'm very affected by lights, and depending on the light, clearly lights aren't always painful for me, but certain lights in certain rooms at certain times of day can be really painful to my eyes, and I may need to dim them or just turn them off entirely. It doesn't mean that if I'm outside in the sunlight that clearly I don't have an issue with light. I'm just not as affected by sunlight as I would be by a lamp or by a light that's flickering. A fourth point to talk about is that one of the most disabling experiences cited by autistics is social rejection, a phenomenon that is greatly exacerbated by the rhetoric surrounding cures, prevention, and awareness. This is really the critical point of why it's so dire for us to move towards acceptance. What we talk about a lot when we're talking about awareness, unfortunately, is really focusing in on all of those socially stigmatizing traits that we've used for years to alienate and isolate autistic people. We talk a lot about the negative aspects and the difficulties encountered. And unfortunately, a lot of that dialogue isn't actually even about the difficulties encountered by the autistic individual. Instead, what we'll often talk about is how difficult it is to raise an autistic child, or to support an autistic person in society, or to educate an autistic child in our school system. Well, clearly, this is taking the message away from the people who actually need conversations to be happening about their needs in their reality. When we talk about acceptance, the phrase this year that's being used is that acceptance is an action, and I think that is just a wonderful way of putting it. Acceptance is something that we live and breathe every day. It shouldn't be confounded with the idea of resignation. We're not saying, well, it is what it is. They're autistic people and they will never be able to have any skills, so let's just not work on them and let's not do therapy, and maybe we should just say, it's okay if you never learn anything beyond the age of 2 because you're autistic. This is clearly not what we mean by acceptance. What we're talking about here is helping every human being, autistic or otherwise, thrive to the greatest of their capacity and the greatest of their skill level. So if there's somebody who has a deficit in terms of speech development, well, clearly they would want to expand on skills that they have challenges with, and we as a society should want to encourage and help them do so. What we can't do in that process, though, is demean their experience or demean their ways of socially communicating, which may extend far beyond speech. We have to recognize that while we are working on skills that do need to be developed, every human being has skills to be developed, we also have to support and sustain and help nurture the skills that are already existing there, and that every human being has the capacity for communication, for growth, and for thriving. Finally, I want to really call attention to the last line. Nick tells us ultimately to describe autism as a disorder represents a value judgment rather than a scientific fact. This line has stuck with me since I first read this post. I think it is so powerful a statement about how it is we are perceiving and talking and engaging in the topic of autism. We need to broaden our social perspective of what it means to be not only typically developing, but a human being, right? Can we not coexist in a world of humanity where individuals' differences are celebrated and supported, and where we recognize that every human being is a worthwhile member of our society, and that quality of life takes many forms, each of which dependent on how supported every individual is. So yes, I do think that Nick is bang on when he says that there are many value judgments happening, the importance of speech over the importance of, for example, writing, which many autistic people have found to be a better mechanism for them to communicate, or even just the importance of physical body interaction, and that a stim, as we call them, can be a large useful tool in terms of actually exhibiting communication and state of mind. Once we accept that autism is a reality and a naturally occurring fact, rather than something that is bad to be dismissed, cured, or prevented, then we open up the opportunity to really explore the diversity within our human community, not only the neurological diversity, but wrapping that in intersectionally into all the diversity of the human experience. I would encourage you all to take the time to read more of Nick Walker's writings, which can be found at neurocosmopolitanism.com. I will be, of course, linking that in this video as well as in the blog post. I do look forward to continuing on with this journey with you. We will be looking at a new post tomorrow. And again, forgive the jitters and the slightly awkward turn of the video blog. Part of the purpose of doing this is to really take myself out of a comfort zone and do something that is, for me, very socially awkward and difficult, in an attempt to show solidarity with people who have to engage with difficult, uncomfortable social realities on a daily basis. So I thank you for listening, I thank you for joining us, and I thank you, Nick Walker, for sharing your words on what is autism. It is a message that is definitely much needed in our community. Have a great night.